Hashem, today's daf yomi is Avodah Zarah daf Yud Dalet Avodah Zarah 14, and we're going to start on the bottom of Yud Gimel Amud Beis, the bottom of 13b. Today's daf is dedicated for a shmir for the Chayalim, Matzah for the Shuyim, and Yeshua for Am Yisrael in this Eis Tzara. We start at the Mishnah on the bottom of 13b. The Mishnah says, Eud Varma Asurim Limkor Ove Kochavim. These are the things that one is not allowed to sell to an idolater, meaning the whole year, not just 3 days before their festival, but the whole year he can sell them. Rashi says that the reason is because he needs them for idolatry. So no matter when he buys them, he's going to use them for idolatry. Ritva suggests that the reason that he can't, that the whole year they're prohibited is because the idolater is going to, that these are very precious items, which the idolater is going to save and save for his holiday, because these are something that he gets and he saves the whole year just to use on his holiday. So these are the things that are prohibited to sell. The ichtroblin, which the Gemara is going to tell us what it is. Ubeno shuach. The Gemara is going to tell us what that is. Ufetotrot. The Gemara is going to tell us what that is. Uavona, that's frankincense. Tarnagol halavan, and a white rooster. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says, Mudaram karlo tarnagol lavan, beina tarnagolam. Rabbi Yehuda says you could sell him a white rooster if it was mixed in with the other roosters. And if this is a rooster that's being sold by itself, this white rooster, then you do have a heter, you could chop off one of the claws and sell it because they wouldn't bring an animal that's missing a limb or a digit to idolatry. All other matters, Daman, Mutar Perushan Asr. All other matters that a non-Jew is buying from a Jew, if he doesn't specify, it's permitted to sell it to him. But if he says it's for the purpose of idolatry, it's going to be prohibited. Rameir Omer, Af Dekel Tav, V'chatzav, V'niklas, Asr Karla Ovik Chavim. Rameir adds, you can't sell a good palm tree. We'll see what that means. And a chatzav, we'll see what that means. And in niklas, these are things that are prohibited to sell to idolatry. So the Gemara on the top of Yudalat Amud Aleph says, "My etztroblin." What is this etztroblin that we're saying you can never sell to the idolater? So the Gemara explains that it is a turnita, which Rashi says is like an era is a type of cedar, also a shita. Like shita is usually said acacia wood, but anyway, it's a type of cedar. It's whatever it is. There are minu, but is that really the case that a striblin is a tornita? The more challenges from a brisa that the brisa is talking about those things which have the kedusha of shvius, and say that these items also have the holiness of Shavuos. Hosifo and alaxin, mitztroblin, mochsasin, ubeno shuach. They added on these items the ichtroblin and the beno shuach. V'isal kadaitach, ichtroblin tornisa. And if you want to say that ichtroblin is the tornisa, and we're going to adopt Rashi's explanation, and the tornisa misa b'shvius is the tornisa really something that the laws of the sabbatical year apply to. But then we learn in the Brisa, the general rule is kol sheyeshlo ikar, anything that has a root, i.e., you don't need to replant it every year. Yeshlo shvius. Then the laws of the sabbatical year apply. But kol she'elo ikar, but everything that doesn't have a root, elo shvius. The laws of the sabbatical year don't apply. A little tricky because what do you mean if it has a root? And it's going to last in the year through the winter, why would the sabbatical years apply to that? You didn't plant it. That should be the opposite. So some say we're talking about something that grows wild on its own. But anyway, we see from here that the tornita, that it can't be that that strublin is a tornita, because the tornita would, if that's the case, the sabbatical year would apply to it, but the Erez has no ikar, and that's another problem with this. That the cedar tree typically that we associate with, in our knowledge, does have a root. So anyway, therefore, Rav Safra says we're talking about Peirei de Arza. Rav Safra says we're talking about the fruits of the cedar tree, which is an acorn. Acorn. And Kiyos Rav and Amar Melazar Peirei de Arza. He says we're talking about the acorn. So that's what the Strobelin is, the acorns. That's what we're talking about. But Tosfos has a different approach, and he says that Ternita is, because of the questions we raised, Tosfos suggests that the issue is, Rabbeinu Tam says that Ternita is actually a type, something that comes from the ground, like sulfur. And that's how he answers some of these questions. Anyway, we're on the topic of Boker Tov, Jeff. So we're on top of 14a. The Gemara says that the Benot Shuach, you're never allowed to sell to the idolaters. Again, either because they lose it in their idolatry, or else because it's something so special. So, what are these Benot Shuach? These are the white figs. These are the white figs. So remember where we had the Benot Shuach and Mesech HaShvuos? Remember we had it twice. Do you remember the two references to Benot Shuach and Mesech HaShvuos? We said Tosfos reminds us of one of them. We said that it was, if you said that this is the leftover, the Ketzla Mizbeach, Kibenos Shuach or Adam, She'ocham Osam B'kinuach HaSadeh. And that we put the extra sacrifices, the vows, they fill up the altar like the Benot Shuach of a person. The person eats these figs for dessert. And you remember the other place we had it was not in the Gemara, but it was in the Tosfos on the top of Amar Beis, where we talked about what was the fruit in the Garden of Eden. And we said that was one of the theories was the fig tree, and that's why it's called Benot Shuach, because from bending over, Adam has to work now because he ate from that fruit. He has to now work the land. Anyway, we say here, okay, the next piece is Upetotroch. It says it's Strobelin, and then it also says the Benot Shuach, Upetotroch. What are the Petotroch? Amar Bar Bachan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Biptotrotein Shanu. No, it doesn't mean that these were separate fruits. It means with their stems. Petotroch means the Benot Shuach and the Strobelin are prohibited only when they're with their stems, because then they're going to be used as like a decoration to be hung in front of their idolatry. Rashi says, that's how they were used for their worship. That makes sense. Say acorns, they would hang them up as a decoration. Lavona, what's the frankincense? That's prohibited to sell them. The purest frankincense. Tana, we learned in the Mishnah, Mikun, and then we learned in the Brisa, Mikun Mochrin Chavila, even though you're not allowed to sell them to the idolaters, you could sell them if you're selling them wholesale. Because, and then since he's going to get a whole bunch of them, so therefore you can sell it wholesale to them. And as a consequence, he's obviously not using it for his idolatry because he wouldn't need that amount. So the Gemara says, but still, but still we have a concern. Maybe he's going to go and sell it to someone else, and he's going to make an offering from it. So I'm Rabbi, alifnei mefaktinan, alifnei delifnei lo mefaktinan. Yeah, we're worried about lifnei. Rashi says we're worried that lifnei ivar, we're commanded not to make a milchshel, not to make a stumbling block for the idolater with something that's prohibited to him. And that's why all these things are prohibited, because the Noahide is prohibited to, again, worshiping idolatry. So we're not allowed to give him this item which will cause him to sin. But lifnei, the lifnei, but before that we're not worried about. Like here, for sure he doesn't want it for idolatry, and so we can't not give it to him, because then he might come and sell it to somebody else, and so and make the offering, and so therefore that's too much. That's too attenuated. Lifting the lifting. The Gemara says, uh, uh, no, that's what it is. The grama would be permitted. I mean, it is the same concept. It's the same concept. Lifnei to lifnei, that it's attenuated, basically. It's too removed. It's not direct enough. V'tarnagol, and also we said in the Mishnah that you can't sell them a white chicken. But Rabbi Yehuda says if it was mixed in amongst the other chickens, it's okay. Rabbi Yonah, Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Zvid, V'ikad Emas, Rabbi Yonah, Rabbi Zera, Tarnagol, and me. If a guy was walking around the marketplace and saying, "I want to buy a chicken," who's got a Tarnagol? Tarnagol, and me. So then Mutar Umkorlo Tarnagol Lavan. Then Rabbi Yonah says the prohibition of the Mishnah against selling him a Tarnagol Lavan is not going to apply because the guy is clearly not looking for it. He just needs a chicken. But if he says Tarnagol Lavan on me, if he's walking around saying who's got a white chicken, that's prohibited. Also Imkorlo Tarnagol Lavan. Then you can't sell him the white chicken. So the Gemara says, wait, are we going to get? Let's analyze what Rabbi Yonah has said. Because now we're going to our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda says Milchor Tarnagol Lavan being a Tarnagolan. He says you can sell him a white chicken if it's mixed in with all the other chickens. So how does Rabbi Yonah's teaching dovetail with Rabbi Yehuda and the Mishnah? Now, Hechidami, what's a scenario? So the Gemara says Hechidami. So what's Rabbi Yonah's scenario where he says Tarnagol and me that is allowed and Tarnagol Lavan is not allowed? So what's the scenario? Tarnagol Lavan with me, Tarnagol Lavan with me. So if he would say who has a white chicken, well then I feel ben a Tarnagol and Navilo, then Rabbi Yehuda would not be allowing that even amongst the other chickens, because he specified. Tarnagol me. Must be that he said who has a chicken. And even if he just says he has a chicken, well, Rabbi Yehuda ben Tarnagol in bifnei atzmo lo. Rabbi Yehuda would say even if he just says who has a chicken, he would only allow it amongst the other chickens, but not by itself. And according to Tanakama, he wouldn't even allow it amongst the other chickens. So this is a big problem with Rabbi Yonah, because Rabbi Yonah says it's only if you say Tarnagol and me, it's allowed, but it doesn't work with either with the Rabbanan, who wouldn't even allow it amongst the other chickens, and it wouldn't even allow it according to Rabbi Yehuda under that scenario. So says the Gemara, no, Amar Nachman Yitzchak, Hacham Mayatzkinan. So he says, our Mishnah that says that you're not allowed to sell the white chicken on its own, according to Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, you can't even sell it amongst the other chickens. That's talking about a different scenario. What are we talking about? We go into Amar Zev Zeh. He said, who has a white chicken? Who has a black chicken? Who has a red chicken? That's what he's talking about. That under those circumstances, the Chachamim would say you can't sell it, and Rabbi Yehuda would say you're allowed to sell it amongst the others. Why? Let's look at Rashi. Masnisin. Our Mishnah is talking about a case to Rabbi Yehuda b'fnei atzmo l'tanakama l'gamri. So our Mishnah where Rabbi Yehuda says on its own you can't do it, but amongst others you can, and Tanakama says always prohibited. Can go into mi kara itkar lavan v'shachar ba'adam. At first he says who has a white, a black, and a red one. Helkach lavan Rabbi Yehuda b'fnei atzmo asar. We would say it's prohibited, the white one on its own, mi kara itkar, because since he mentioned it first, Hash to shakil lavan, and now he's taking the white one. V'azole meikara nami ikavim lavan. And so since now he takes the white one, it's clear that he really only wanted the white one, because he says who has a white, black, or red chicken, and then he takes the white one. It's clear he just said black and red to cover up in case a Jew is selling it to him, and that we're not going to allow him to do unless he takes a whole bunch. So that's the scenario. So, and the Chachamim wouldn't even allow that. So the Gemara says, Tanya Nami Hachi Amar Rabbi Yehuda, indeed we have a similar price to Rabbi Yehuda says, Emasai V'Zman Sha'amar Tarnagol Zelo Ava. That when does Rabbi Yehuda say that it's prohibited. If he says, who has this white chicken of Omar Zev mutter, but if he says this and this, it'd be permitted, meaning if he then puts it amongst all the others. And even so, now the Gemara gives us another ruling, a separate ruling. Even if he says, who has this white, can you sell me this white chicken? But but if he's just doing it for his party, for his son, or he's got a sick person and he wants to give him a nice white chicken, it's going to be permitted. The Gemara says, really? But how could this be the case? Didn't we learn over Klam Shas Mishal Beno Eno Aser also Ayom also Ish Bavad? So also Ayom also Ish Mi Aser. Didn't we say if the guy's making a wedding, you can never sell him as white chicken because we're worried he's going to praise his idol on the day of his son's wedding, etc. So the Gemara says, "Amar Yitzchak Bar Masharshia bitavazik, bitavazik." So now what we're talking about a case is where he's not the actual wedding, but it's the associated parties around the wedding. A lot of parties around weddings, and so therefore, it's not going to be a day of worship for the idolatry. But if it was actually a wedding, it wouldn't be allowed. So we learned to our Mishnah. All other matters, staman muter perushan aser. All other things you could sell if you don't specify. If you specify, it's prohibited. My staman or my perush. And what do you mean stam and perush? So ilema stama de ka'amar chiti chavarta. If you want to say when it says stam, it means white wheat, pirushan, and when he specifies not allowed the kamar avodas kochavim. If he says I want white wheat, it's okay. If he says I want white wheat for idolatry, that's prohibited. Oh, that doesn't make sense if that's what our Mishnah is talking about. There's a Gemara on the top of your Dawud on my base. Obviously, if he says give me the white wheat for idolatry, you can't do the sale. Elastaman dika'amar chiti. Perushan the kamar chavarta. So if you want to say when is it allowed if it says wheat, but when is it prohibited if he says give me white wheat? Mikal the town go I feel stamin namino. Then it would, even if you just said a regular chicken, it would be prohibited. So the Gemara says no. Amri olam staman the kamar. So what's our conclusion? When he says stam, sell me a stam piece of wheat. Staman the kamar chiti chavarti. He says stam when is allowed? He says sell me white wheat. Perushan the kamar. Avodas kochavim. When is it prohibited? He says, sell it to me for idolatry. So what's the chiddush? Pirushan it's jechalei. The chiddush is even if he says sell it to me for idolatry, it's prohibited. Why? We might have thought it's permitted. You might have thought it's permitted. You might have thought that this idolatry, even though he says he's buying it for idolatry, he's not really buying it for idolatry. He loves idolatry so much. He thinks just like I love it. Everybody else loves it. I might say, okay, give me some white wheat for idolatry. Maybe they'll give it to me. I'll get a good deal. And so therefore, he doesn't really mean for idolatry. He's just pretending to be from. He's not really from. Kamash, no, we don't say that. If he says, give me white wheat for idolatry, now you can't sell it. By Ravashi, Tarnago Lavan Katua Lami. Ma'ulim Korlo Tarnago Lavan Shoim. So let's say he says, give me a white rooster with missing a missing finger. Are you allowed to sell him a white whole rooster? Because they can't bring the white rooster with the missing finger as idolatry. So me, Amrina, do we say me the Amar Katua Lavodas Kachavim Kabai? So we say the fact that he's asking for a chicken missing a finger, it clearly doesn't need it for idolatry. Odelma Yerumi Kamarim, or maybe he's just trying to trick everybody and making them think it's not for idolatry and it'll be prohibited. And Imtim Tzolmer Hai Yerumi Hud Kamarim. So if you want to say he's really just tricking people, Tarnago level on me, Tarnago level on me, Viavale Shachor, Vishakol, Viavale Dom, Vishakol, Ma'alim Kol Lavan. So let's say, even if you say, let's say the following scenario, let's say he says, who has a white root chicken, and you give him a black chicken and he buys it, and a red chicken and he buys it. Now can you also give him a white one? Ma'alim Kol Lavan. Me, I'm reading Kima Diavale Shachor, Vishakol, Adam Vishakol. Do we say since he took the black and the red, it's clearly not meant for idolatry. Or maybe he was just tricking Pekum. So when Eliyahu Hanavi comes and there's no more Avodah Zarah, we're going to ask him these questions because it's still going to be a mitzvah to learn about Avodah Zarah even when there's no more Avodah Zarah. So says the Gemara, Rabbi Meir says you also are not allowed to sell him a dekel tav. What is a dekel tav? Amar Rav Chisda Avimi Gemiri the Avodas Kochavim the Avram Avinu Dalamei Perkei Avram. Avram Avinu had a say Masechta Avodah Zarah, but it had 400 chapters in it. Vanan Chamisha Tanan, and we have 5 chapters. Avram Avinu had 400 chapters in his Masechta Avodah Zarah. Why? Because he had so many people around him who were doing Avodah Zarah. And so therefore he was the only one to know about Hashem. And so therefore he had to learn so much about the Hilchos Avodah Zarah. But us nowadays, it's so diminished. So we only have 5 chapters. And even though we only have 5 chapters, we still don't know what we say in these 5 chapters. Umar says, what's your problem? My kasha. The Katani Rameir af dekel tav chatzav v'niklas atzerim korov v'chavim. And Rameir says you're also not allowed to sell the dekel tav, the chatzav, and the niklas. You're not allowed to sell to the idolaters. Now, what's a dekel tav? So it says dekel tav. You might think is a good palm tree, but dekel tav hudulam is amninon. A dekel bayish is amninon. You can't sell a good palm tree, but you could sell a bad palm tree. That doesn't make sense. You're not allowed to sell to idolater anything that's attached to the ground because it's a prohibition of doing something good for them. So therefore, why does it say you can't sell a good palm? You can't even sell a bad palm. So we don't understand it. So therefore, the Gemara responds, Avimi responds, no, what is a dekel tav? My dekel tav, peros dekel tav. It just means the fruits of the good palm tree you can't sell. Peros dekel tav means the fruits of the good palm tree you can't sell. And what's chatzav? Kashba. Chatzav is what's called a kashba. It's a type of dates. Some say, you remember, Jeff, where the chatzva else appeared in Baba Basra? So Rashi reminds us, Ista Amar Hainu Chatzuva Shebo Tiaches Yoshua Sa'aretz the Esav Nahu. So some say that hold on. I don't know. So some say that this is what Joshua used, this type of tree that he used to divide up the land, to set the boundaries, because it went straight down into the land. So Botiachem, that's how Joshua, Botiachem or Techam Yoshua as Haaretz. That's how Joshua divided up the land. Hold on 1 second. So that's the Chatzuva tree. Remember that in Baba Basra, that it went straight down. He planted on the boundaries in order to make this distinction. Shabot Techam Yoshua Sar. What? Okay, I'm sure you do, actually. You got to give it a few minutes. And therefore, it has a nice leaves to it, which they would use for the idolatry. So, and what's the Niklas? Kias Rav Dimi Amar Cham Rayosef Kuryati. It's a kuryati. It's a type of fruit. Some say it's the dust of the lavona. But Rashi rejects that approach. And Amar Abaye or Abdimi, it's not Niklas. We say Niklas, we study Niklas and we don't know what it is. Va'atomer is kuryati. So you tell me it's a kuryati. My honest one, I have no idea what that is either. You're not helping me. I'm like, what? Amarei, it does. I am helping you. Azos Hasim, when you go to Eretz Yisrael, Amrslo Niklas, you say to them, Niklas, well, Yadi, they won't know what you're talking about. Amrslo Kuryati, the Yadi, the Kamach, they'll show it to you. So you go to Eretz Yisrael, they'll show it to you. So it says the next Mishnah, Makom Shenagu Imkor Behemadako of Dikochavim Mocher. In a place where they had to practice to sell the small animals, Behemadaka is like sheep or goat, then those places you're allowed to sell it because they're not concerned about having intercourse with the sheep and the goats there. So that's okay. But Malcolm Shinago Shalom Kor Emochim, place where they have a practice not to sell, you can't sell because you're concerned that you're going to give them their animal and they're going to sleep with it. You're not allowed to sell, you're never allowed to sell them these large animals because, as Rashi says, because since they're used for work, and we're concerned that they're going to use it for work on Shabbos. And if you sell it to them, you might come to lend to them or borrow them, or lend to them or rent to them. And that is a prohibition for your animal to work on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda matir b'shvura. Rabbi Yehuda allows if it's broken, because then it's not going to work. The Gemara is going to explain why. That Uben Beser Matir Besusim. Beser allows it with a horse. You had a question, Jeff? Yeah.
You listen to somebody who think they're going to use it in a way that
On Shabbos, yeah.
just on Shabbos or other things too.
Well, the Torah says specifically that your animals are not allowed to work on Shabbos. So you're saying you're going to rent to them. They're not prohibited about Kalayim, and your animal is not prohibited in Kalayim except if you own it. But your animal has to rest on Shabbos. So your animal can't work on Shabbos. So if you rent it or lend it, it's prohibited on Shabbos. All right, we'll stop the recording here. Shikoyach to everybody. What?